Hey, my name is John Weirs from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and I'm here to talk to you about the Marine and Hydrokinetic Data Repository. We're going to cover briefly a presentation on data management and submission best practices, and then I'm going to go into a live demo of data submission. So stay tuned for the live demo coming up here in about 25 minutes. So just a little background on the MHKDR. It is housed on OpenEI because OpenEI has an energy information, flexible, scalable, and secure architecture that's been around since 2009. It was started as part of the Open Government Initiative and was DOE's open data platform for more than a decade now. There are a lot of great functionality and improvements built into it throughout the years that the MHK Data Repository has been able to leverage. Since mid-2015, and even some of the tools that have come since then have built onto it. So it's a really much a community or an ecosystem of information management tools, and that's why we like to keep the MHKDR on OpenEI. Why are we doing this? Why does the MHKDR exist? Well, there's an intrinsic value in sharing data, and I really like this quote from DOE's strategic plan, May of 2011, that success should be measured not when a project is completed or an experiment concluded, but when scientific and technical information is disseminated. That's just to say that if you have the most amazing invention or discovery in the world, it's not going to do anyone any good unless you tell somebody about it. And then, of course, there are different ways of telling people, and we'll cover that here in a minute. But at our core, our mission at the MHK Data Repository is to provide DOE and the public access to foundational data to enable future research and really to protect DOE's investment in research and development. We're going to talk about this a little bit more later too, but on the right there, you can see the MHKDR's network of data sharing partners. And it's just important to remember that the MHKDR is not just a repository of DOE, MRE, and MHK information, but it's also a gateway to an entire community of scientific data repositories. And submitting a data set to the MHKDR is really a means of mass communicating with the greater MRE and MHK scientific communities. And the other reason we're doing this is ways of sharing science are shifting. Borrowed this slide from a colleague, Quay at Stanford, from another presentation, and I really like it, this concept of things changing throughout time. So in the beginning, research and science was really a hobby done as a performance for nobles and demonstrated in courts and salons. We've come a long way since then to the age of peer review, where we're really being stringent with our observations and making sure that our experiments are reproducible and reviewed by the community. But we're quickly moving into a new world of data sharing, where the foundation for our experiments are included in the publication process. A lot of major journals are starting to require data submissions as a supplemental piece of your publication requirements. And there's a lot of emphasis on the Fair Data Act or a way of structuring information so that it's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. We'll be talking about that quite a bit too. What is the MHKDR? The MHKDR, as you probably already know, is a data repository for all the data generated from research and development activities funded by DOE's Water Power Technologies Office. It's currently home to all kinds of data. Anything that DOE WPTO has funded, we have in there, from we have energy price data to moist data to device performance, lab tests, environmental assessments, even video and acoustic files, etc. So all kinds of data. So when we're talking about data, we're using a very loose definition of data here. Any form of digital information, really. What kinds of data is DOE looking for in the MHK Data Repository? Well, we want everything from WPTO-funded research, all the maps, charts, photos, logs, all the data generated from projects. At the end of the day, it's taxpayer money, and so the taxpayers should have access to these data. And there we'll be talking about the process of making those data available to the public. But we also want the raw data. because there's an intrinsic value to raw data as well. Raw data is free to be reused in a number of different ways. Summary data by its very nature is filtered down to the information relevant to the given project that created it. But the raw data that's generated from those projects is free to be used in any context, including topics unrelated. And that's really what allows it to fuel innovation. Is you might think that your data set on resource assessment is only applicable to your particular device or MHK project, but somebody in a whole other field can come along and correlate those data in a whole new way and create an innovative new project, possibly completely unrelated to your field of expertise. So that raw data definitely has a value. That being said, there is such a thing as too raw. So we want to have our data refined enough that it's comprehensible, usable, and useful. And those are definitely two different things. So in this very simplified example, we have information coming off of a sensor or a device on the left, and at least we know it's time in seconds, but there's no real context here, and we're using relative time. At least we know the units, but we don't know, is 60 seconds, the first 60 seconds of the day? Is it from midnight? Is it from the moment the sensor was turned on? We don't really know. And so to really make those data useful to third parties, potential data users, we need that contextual information. And so it just takes a little bit of extra work to make sure that your data are traveling with the right metadata, the information about the data themselves, to carry that context and be informative. And so here on the right side, we can see that we have a precise time. It's easier to contextualize. We know the date, units, and more importantly, we know the time zone. And so we actually can correlate now information in this particular data set with any external event around the world. If we wanted to see if somehow this particular experiment was influenced by an earthquake 20 miles away, we can now actually check that out because we have contextualized information. So that's what we mean by refined. But when it comes to raw data, as raw as possible while still being useful is desired. I'm not going to talk about this too much, but the 3 tiers of data, there's a section in the FAQ on the MHKDR that can go into more detail on this, but it's just a helpful guide if you have the option of providing your data in more than one format. The tier system can help you pick the most impactful format to submit your data in. And in a nutshell, it's just saying that, a PDF, if that's all you could do, that's great. But a CSV or something that's editable is easier for others to digest than a PDF. And then the higher tier is something that's standardized and structured and machine readable. And so that it's considerably easier to incorporate into existing code or experiments. So that's what we're looking for. That's the type of data we want and the preferred formats. What does DOE not want? Well, we definitely don't want personally identifiable information of any kind. No social security numbers, no bank account numbers, no home phone numbers or personal email addresses. Public contact information is always okay. So if you have email or name of a point of contact for a particular data set, not only is that allowed, it's also encouraged. And as you see in the submission form, we require at least one point of contact for every data submission so that people can reach out to that person with questions about the data. And the other thing we don't want are any data not suitable for eventual public release. The MHKDR is a public data dissemination platform, so all data on the MHKDR are destined for eventual public release. Many of them are released immediately after they're curated, and we'll talk about curation in a little bit. But there is an option to place data under moratorium if it's subject to a CRADA or another collaborative research agreement or contains some sort of proprietary information. Then per contract with your DOE technical monitor, you can determine a future release date at which time to release that data in accordance with your previously agreed upon plan. However, any data that's permanently proprietary or definitely requires some sort of license or is behind a paywall should not be put on the MHKDR. We're also not looking for duplication of effort. So if things are already out there online, then we encourage you to link to them in their existing home. There's no reason to upload an additional copy of them to the MHKDR. It supports links. And as you'll see during the demo, not only does it support links, it supports smart links. So a great example of this is code that's on GitHub. There's no reason to upload code files to the MHKDR. If your code's in an open source, publicly accessible repository, you can just link to that repository and the MHKDR will automatically detect that it's a GitHub link and pull in the metadata from your code, making that whole submission process a little easier for you. One of the things we do ask for during that submission process is that you define a location for your data. We have two ways of defining a location. For each resource that's uploaded, you'll need to specify a location, and I'll demonstrate this here in just a couple minutes. You can use the area selector, zoom, drag, click to put a box around your data, or if you know that it was originated from a very precise location, you can give it a point. But whenever possible, we encourage you to use a box. And then for abstract concepts like things that are universally applicable, like analysis or code or things that work essentially anywhere in the world, you can use this predefined links beneath the map to quickly identify the world. And while it may seem silly to attribute an entire data set to the world, there's actually a method to our madness. Behind the scenes, all major search engines are attributing locations to any search out there, and having location metadata just elevates your search results to the top of the major search engines. And so at the end of the day, it's just about feeding the beasts to make sure that your data is prioritized over results that don't have location data. Google, for example, is smart enough to realize that if I'm searching for a wave height spectrometer, then I know in Colorado, although that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, Google would be smart enough to say that that particular data set's associated with the world. Colorado is part of the world. Therefore, I'm going to bump this up to the top of the list for John. So it's all about giving your data context. We talked about feeding the search engines. That's context to increase the discoverability of the data and make sure it's easier for people to find it. We talked about creating context for understanding, adding just enough information to that raw data so that it's usable, reusable, understandable, and so that the end user has confidence in their ability to use it properly. The last thing we want is for one of the potential users of our data to misinterpret the data or not apply various fields properly. And so the metadata that we're collecting is an opportunity for you to provide all the relevant contextual information to allow people to use your data responsibly. And a great example of that is, if you had an experiment where sensors were recording around the clock for several days, and then somebody tripped over a cable and unplugged one of the sensors and it recorded zeros for a few minutes, that would be an important piece of contextual information that you may want to plug in there. And hey, by the way, end user, the zeros on day 2 from hour 3 to hour 4 are due to a sensor malfunction, not an actual recorded zero value, for example. So that's the type of information that we're looking for when we're asking for metadata information. And it can be a little tricky because we get mired in our projects and our research experiments, and we're used to that sort of insider knowledge of what happened. And it's important to kind of put our outsider cap on and look at things from that perspective of somebody who's not familiar with your particular project or experiment, and give them all the contextual information they need to understand the data. So back to why we'd want to do it again. One of the reasons for submitting the data to the MHKDR is that, like as I mentioned earlier, it's a means of communicating with the broader research community. Here's that network diagram again of network sharing partners. Every data submission to the MHKDR is automatically broadcast into the DOE Open Data Repository, the DOE Open Data Explorer. Thomson Reuters generates a mini press release for it. It shows up in the main OpenEI dataset section. It shows up on data.gov, and it's added to Primer. It's even generated a dataset record in Google Dataset Search, which feeds into Google Scholar. And so as you can see here in just a couple of minutes when we do the live demo, the metadata that we create for a submission travels out to all the sites you see on this map, and dozens more actually that I just didn't take the time to list. It generates records in all of them. And one of the things that we allow is the ability to attribute authors to data sets, just like publications and journal articles. You know, the people that are contributing to datas and charts and figures can get their names added to the list, and that will show up in Google Scholar, and citations of data are starting to happen. And so your H scores and stuff can be dependent upon MHKDR data submissions. You can boost your reputation using them. The other reason, of course, being that the MHKDR is just part of the Primer community and the greater network of information hubs in the MRE space. And it's not trying to be a one-stop shop for all information in the MHK space. It's just a data repository for WPTO's funded research and development activities. And so we're trying to feed those activities and the information about them to this whole community. And the advantage there being that for every user that comes to the MHKDR and downloads a data set, data.gov, for example, we see 1,000 users downloading MHKDR data sets. It's a massive site. It gets millions of hits a day. And by submitting to the MHKDR, your information will be on that site. So you gain that exposure for free, which is great. To date, the MHKDR has over 2,000 resources in it, over 700 gigabytes of directly downloadable files. We're in the process of incorporating it with the DOE Data Lake, which is currently being formed, which is opening the door for big data sets in the MHKDR. And we now have some wave height data in the neighborhood of 20 terabytes that's also available for access that we'll soon be including in these statistics as well. Very exciting thing, data lakes. If there's time at the end, anyone has questions on it, I'm happy to answer that. But in the interest of time, I'll keep going. All of this stuff we're doing is really trying to help you put your data to work for you, to help make it useful. It helps to set it free, to tell a story, to get it out there. There's a lot of stigma about sharing data. There's a lot of I don't want to say an old school mentality, but a more traditional mentality of keeping research proprietary. It's my research, it's my baby, that sort of sentiment. And in some cases that is still a valid choice, but in many cases we're finding that it's much more valuable to individual researchers to get the word about their data out there to the rest of the community. More often than not, data sets discovered on the MHKDR by other researchers in the same field are not leveraged in nefarious ways. People are generally interested in advancing technology and don't want to reinvent the wheel. And so when people are finding research data sets that are in line with their own research efforts or their own desires, they're not just taking the data and running with it. They're actually calling up the data submitters and saying, my gosh, I didn't realize you were working on this too. Let's collaborate. Or, hey, we were planning on doing this. Instead of us reinventing the wheel, how about we just fund you to continue your work and do it more? And so there's a real direct advantage that we're seeing to researchers in this space for sharing their data, which is great. We already talked a little bit about making data useful by providing that necessary context and that metadata is information about something. But just to recap a little bit, it's another way of thinking about it is a means to communicate effectively. You know, when you're putting your data together and putting your submission together, you want to make sure you're communicating it to the community and to that end user effectively. And when I put together the sample submission here in a few minutes, you'll see that when we're asking for the metadata fields, we're really asking you to organize the information and communicate it as if you would a conference paper or something that you would communicate to that scientific community, not as a memo to DOE, trying to avoid that internal speak or trying to avoid the assumption that everyone out there is familiar with the intricate inner workings of your experiment or research project. The other thing that's important if you're just starting out in your project and you're trying to plan ahead is to have a provenance strategy. Don't assume that every data set's going to be perfect right from the beginning. Plan to have multiple versions and multiple iterations. It helps to store your files internally, not just by version, but by vintage, so that if you do run into a situation where you're updating data from last year, I wouldn't want to accidentally call my 2010 data 2021 data just because I updated it today. If the data really are from 2010, maybe it's the 2021 revision of the 2010 data, for example. If that's just confusing, let me know, and I'd be happy to answer questions on it here in a moment, but hopefully that makes sense to many of you. My team, at the end of the day, we see ourselves as being tasked with protecting DOE's investment in research and development activities through the openness and transparency of the data from those activities, through the securing of sensitive data, and by providing that provenance and that scientific record for perpetuity. So that's the end of the presentation. This is the MHKDR, if you're not familiar with it. To access data, you can just go and find data and start searching. We have the search interface filters based off technology types, topics, featured projects, collection method, and rough aggregation of data type. We've also added this in recent years that lets you look for all data results or just those that are already publicly available. You can see the status over here. Some of these data sets are awaiting release, some of them are in curation. When you do submit a data set to the MHKDR, the first thing that happens is it goes into a curation period where one of our curators looks at it and evaluates the metadata for completeness and relevance and accuracy. They're not going down into the weeds of the data or the findings themselves. No one's questioning the results of your work. We're just looking at what you submitted and your description of what you submitted to make sure the description matches and that you didn't accidentally upload a picture of your dog or reference a file that you forgot to upload. So really just making sure it's complete, relevant, and doesn't contain any PII or other inappropriate information. You can also view all the submissions this way if you prefer to see a list. And then of course in here you can search again the table for wave energy prize type stuff, or you can also sort by organization, by name, by date, etc. If you're just here to submit data, on the home page, you'll find a giant submit data button, but only if you're logged in. You do need an account to submit data with OpenEI. If you don't have one, you can register. It's very easy. We just need a username and email. We're not asking for any other information. It's free. The other way to submit data is to come in here under data and hit submit data. While I'm here, I'm going to point out that we have a few helpful things under help. There's the FAQ, and at any time on the site, you can also hit this contact MHKDR help, and it will open up an email to the MHKDR help address, which actually is just a distribution list to me and my entire team. So if you ever have any questions during submission or with the MHKDR at any point, feel free to pop open that link, shoot us an email, and we'll get right back to you. Okay. So without further ado, let's jump into submitting data. This is our submission form. We have a little left-hand navigation that lets you jump from topic to topic. And this is the entire thing. So we've done quite a bit of work on the back end to try and streamline things and make submission as easy as possible. So hopefully you'll get to see some of that smart technology come through in this demonstration. But without further ado, I'm going to get started here. And so we're going to say this is a test data. I'm coming up with my submission name. Again, make sure you're communicating it to the scientific community. So you want to title this as you would the title of a conference paper. But instead of a topic, it should, or your project, it should describe the contents of your data submission. So I'll say this is test data. from the Pratty 5 wave device. We'll say this is a tank test. Why not? Okay. And I will fix my typo really quick. And description. So this again should describe the contents of the data submission. A helpful guide is to imagine that it starts with this submission contains. So I'm going to say this is going to be 2 days of tank testing data for the Pratty, I'm making this up obviously, Pratty 5 device. And over, I'll say a summary report of the test findings and a link to the code governing the test. This is also your opportunity to put any metadata that's essential to the understanding of your data submission. So any caveats and extraneous features that apply to the entire project would go in here. Say day 3 of testing was canceled and no data was generated, just in case that's relevant. Keywords, this is just like keywords you would do for a conference paper, just to help in the discoverability of your data set. We've taken the liberty of putting some obvious ones in there. A lot of times we found submitters forget the obvious stuff like wave energy. So I'm going to put wave and we'll say Pratty 5. And we'll pretend that it was a Colorado tank test. And if I've already put something in there, it's going to let me know. I can use the keyboard to go back and forth. I can use the mouse. Try to make this as user-friendly as possible. The next thing it's going to ask me for is contact information. By default, it's put my name in there since I have am the user that's logged in, but I can make this anyone. So if I wanted to make Rick Driscoll the contact for this, I could do that. And origination date. This is the date on which this data in the submission were originated. So for a multi-day project like I'm doing now, it could be either the first day or the last day of the test. Our preference is to always put the oldest date of the data set, of an ongoing data set, especially relevant to data streams or things that are live and continually updating. So if you have multiple dates, just select the oldest one. I'll say this started on Valentine's Day. Why not? Question in chat, does the description field have formatting or length restrictions? It's a great question. We don't have too many restrictions on there. We're not going to let you put in script code or HTML or anything like that. But in terms of free text, there's no formatting or restrictions. And as it gets passed to some of our data partners, they adopt various formats where, classic MD markup, where stars become bullets, etc. So you can do bulleted lists if you want. And there's no, and you can do, you can even do headings, etc. if you want to get really crazy. But we, many of our other data partners, this is just a free text field, so we're not insistent upon any of that formatting stuff. We're also not scrubbing it out, trying to be as flexible as possible, and no limit to the size of the field. So if you have 5 paragraphs you want to put in there, you can put them in there. And when our curator comes back, they may shore that up a little bit. They may work with you to scale it down just so it's a little bit more user-friendly on the end side of things. But yeah, you can put whatever you want in there. Good question. Okay, so I've done quite a bit. I'm going to go ahead and save. You'll notice the 2 buttons down here at the bottom, save and submit. Submit will submit it once it's complete, but you can save anytime and save as often as you want. And in fact, if you save and happen to leave and come back later, you'll end up on the MHKDR homepage. You might notice now you have a submission showing up here, and here I'll zoom in a little bit so it's more obvious. You can see the process that a submission goes through, from being in progress, and then once it's done and submitted, it goes into curation. Once it's curated, it goes into our time release vault. For most of our submissions, it's released later that day, unless it's subject to a moratorium, and then it's publicly accessible once it's available. So that's that. If I click this, it'll take me to the submission landing page. We'll talk more about this when we finish our submission, but all you really need to know for right now is when I'm coming back and I want to get back in and change stuff, I come in and click this little edit icon right here. Okay, I'm back in the submission. And I'm going to go ahead and jump down to authors and add an author. By default, it's added me. If I want to, I can put my ORC ID in there. If you're not familiar with ORC IDs, it's a unique identifier for authors. Helps things like Google Scholar track citations and reference back. And you can have as many authors as you want. So I'm going to add here, I'll add Rick. He's also at NREL. And because we're all just making this up, I will add Tom Selleck. PI. Nice. Okay. So those are my authors. You can have as many authors as you want. You can always come back in and edit them. Use the little X's to remove them. And get that all refined. I'll save again, because why not? It doesn't hurt. DOE project title. This is a little tricky. You may have to contact somebody for this if you're not directly related to the original contract or funding with the WPTO. But this will be the name of your actual project and your project number. So this can be an EE number that comes on your contract. If it's a FOA, your FOA awardee number will be tied to the FOA number, and that's where the EE number comes from. If you're a national lab doing work, you can put in your AOP WBS number here. So since I'm a national lab, I'll say that, and I'm just going to make this up, but I'll say that's my WBS. Okay. You'll notice as I'm going through the different number formats, fields turn red if they're invalid. They stop being red if they're valid. I'm going to pick my project lead out of here, and that's that. Another reason we have the save feature there, we fully realize that sometimes you may have to save this and email a few people before you have this information. This information is a requirement from OSTI, DOE's Office of Science and Technical Information, for all DOE funded work, and is a prerequisite to being added to data.gov under the energy category and to being added to OSTI's DOE Data Explorer. So that's why we're asking for that information. And it helps us track on a project by project basis to who submitted what data. Okay, so we'll come back to resources here in a minute. We've talked a little bit about moratorium. I'm going to leave that unchecked because I want my data to be available to the public as soon as possible. But if, let's say, hypothetically, these data were subject to a moratorium, or even more likely, I have a conference coming up next month and I don't want my data released in advance of my presentation. I want to coordinate it all on the same day. I'm going to come in here and say, okay, you know what, I'm presenting on March 8th. So I'll set this up. Notice it defaults to a year in the future. Just be a little careful there. And I'll say, okay, I have this set up to release automatically on March 8th. And then I can save again. And one other thing I'll note that even though I'm not done with the submission, it's generated a unique link to that submission. And on this page, I can come down here. It's automatically generated a citation for it. So if I want to cite it in my paper, I can do that. This gets updated with the more information you pass in, like authors and things like that. I can export the citation to RIS, which is a standard format. I can copy the location, the permanent link to this. Once this gets a DOI, the DOI will show up here, and you can copy that in as well. But this allows you to put references to your data submission right into your paper while you're still working on your paper well in advance of a conference, for example. Okay, I'm going to go back in and show you another feature. So at any time, actually, you can hit the submit button and it's just going to tell you what else you need to do. So if you're not ready to submit, it's going to let you know. So I haven't agreed to the terms and conditions yet. That's an easy one. If I hit submit again, now it's going to tell me that I haven't added any resources, which is the obvious next thing we need to do. So I'm going to go ahead and add some files. So I'm going to open this up, and if you'll excuse me, need to hop back a few levels. And we're going to go into, I thought I had that set up, but I grabbed the wrong test data folder, so apologies there. Okay, I keep all my test data in here. And we're going to grab our PRADI5 data. Okay, here's our PRADI5 data. And I'm just going to go ahead and use the regular shift or command or control functions in my operating system to select multiple. And I'll just grab 3 files and upload them all at once. Okay, easy enough. You know what? Let's say I forgot a file. I want to put one more in there. I'm going to upload this MATLAB file too. Okay. So a few things have happened here. There's some additional metadata required for individual files, and that location information we talked about during the presentation. And you can see the system has automatically detected the type of many of them and pre-filtered it down. So it knows that, especially anything with the word data in it, and as an Excel spreadsheet, it's going to be data. And I go in here to add this information. This is my chance to add a description for this individual file set. For many of these, it'll be kind of obvious. So this will be, but this is especially important place to put any caveats for specific data files. And a great example of that would be MATLAB. So as we get work through this, I'll show you what I mean. So this will be, we'll say this is flow data from, we're going to say device performance data from the first day of testing, a tank test at Bob's facility. Okay. It's automatically found the date from the file name and populated it there. So there's nothing else I have to do. And then I'll say this is performance data from day 2 of the tank test. And then I'll put a caveat in here. We'll say null values at 14:05 p.m. were due to a sensor coming unplugged and not actual nulls. Okay, and it's already found the date for me. That's great. So that's a good caveat. Another great caveat, as I open this for MATLAB, it's saying it's code. I can put the programming language in here. But if I were to say, requires, I don't know, we'll make something up, Wave 24 MATLAB plugin. So especially important to note if accessing that particular data set or file requires any sort of proprietary software download or additional plugin or additional library, you'd want to put that in there. I'm not going to save that. Let's say I change my mind and I don't actually want this file here. In that case, I can click this little red X and it will delete that file. This is a permanent delete. It's designed to protect you, the submitter, from accidentally submitting something you're not supposed to and that DOE is not supposed to have. So if you click that, it is completely gone from the MHKDR and we cannot help you restore it. Unfortunately, you presumably just uploaded it, so you should still have a local copy of it. Okay. In this particular instance, we uploaded a summary document as a JPEG. And so it's pre-filtered as much of the options as it could, but there are a lot of different things an image file could be. It could be a scanned document, as it is in this case, or a chart or a map or a diagram, etc. And so I'll say this is a scanned copy of the final report summarizing performance testing parameters. Okay. And obviously the actual report would be better, but in this particular example, we're saying hypothetically, all I have is a scanned copy of it. And that report was generated after the second day, so we'll say on the 15th. Okay, so we're getting close. So I can hit save. If I try and hit submit, it's going to tell me I still need location info for each resource, and I'm going to do that now. Let's say the actual test occurred at a specific location. If I wanted to, I can move in and place that location here. We'll say San Francisco, San Jose, why not? And I can get as precise as I want. If it's at a specific facility, I can even switch over to point and use the point selector. Okay, that looks good for this example. And once I set it, it kind of remembers what I set. So if I want to apply that to all the rest of the resources, it's very easy. And I'm going to hit save again. Well, let's say there's one thing I haven't demonstrated yet is adding a link. And so I'm going to go grab a link from my history here. So we have the WEX-Sim GitHub page. And if I paste this GitHub link in here, the system's going to automatically recognize that it's a GitHub link. I'm going to give it a title, WEX-Sim for the resource. Okay. So there's the WEX-Sim code. It's automatically detected that it's code. And if I go to add the information for this, it's going to reach out to GitHub and automatically pull in all the metadata from that GitHub repository. In this case, WEX-Sim has the programming language, the original commit date, and a description all in the README file on their GitHub page. And so there's nothing I have to do but accept these changes and hit save. If I wanted to modify them, I could go in and modify things as I see fit. Location, it's code, it's universally applicable. So as we discussed earlier, I'm going to click world and save. And now I'm good. Okay. Let's see if there's anything left for me to do. I hit submit and it's submitting. Nope, success. The submission has been received. It's now currently in curation. There's that progress meter we talked about earlier. And I'm all done. I can go back in and view the submission. I can make changes. I can start another submission. And if I go back to my home page now, I can see that it shows up in my list of recent submissions. I can also find all of my submissions here under the My Submissions tab. So that's data submission in a nutshell. Any questions? Another question in chat, can we make changes to submissions after they've undergone the curation and release process? Currently, no. Once something's publicly available, like it's a DOI, and it becomes a matter of public record. At that point, if you need to make changes to it, we encourage you to contact us and we'll work with you on that. What we're trying to do there is preserve our data provenance strategy. At that point, we're assuming that once it's out there in the community and open for people to access, use, and cite, that it may have already been cited in future work, in which case we wouldn't want to go back and make changes and invalidate somebody else's research. So depending on the nature of those changes, we'll either allow you to add supplemental information or reference a new version of particular data. But once something's public, we typically don't allow changes within a data file, for example. Fortunately, that doesn't come up very often. More often than not, people realize they forgot to submit something supplemental, and that's real easy for us to just add in for you. Good question. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it, and I wish you a wonderful day.